Good evening, it's 8 p.m. local time here in Warsaw. You're watching World News Tonight, and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. In an unprecedented turn of events, the summit in Ramstein in Germany meant to take place on October 12th was cancelled after U.S. President Joe Biden decided to remain in the United States to monitor the situation related to Hurricane Milton. Later today, we will discuss this in more detail with our guest Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy. Before that, however, let's take a look at the latest headlines. Polish-Czech intergovernmental talks on migration took place in Prague. Hurricane Milton closes in on Florida. Nobel Prize in Chemistry goes to 3 scientists for their work on proteins. The high-powered Ramstein summit set down for this weekend has been called off. It was postponed after U.S. President Joe Biden announced he was staying home to deal with the wild weather hitting America. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Damon, has more.
It all started with a message from Washington.
As you know, I put out a statement this morning. I'm canceling my trip to Germany and Africa.
And after initial radio silence from officials across Europe, confirmation today to TVP World that the entire Ramstein summit would be delayed.
In light of the announcement by the White House that President Biden is postponing his visit to Germany due to Hurricane Milton, the October 12 Saturday meeting is postponed. In other words, there will be no event on Saturday. Another date should be announced in the near future.
It will come as a blow to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has his victory plan waiting and ready to be shared with the world. The decision also potentially sets back any sign-off on further military aid for the war-torn country and underlines Ukraine's dependence on American support.
The sheer size of the U.S. economy and its degree to it, it's committed to defense spending over the years, makes it sort of the big person at the table.
Millions are bracing for life-threatening.
President Biden's cancellation notice was a result of the impact of recent Hurricane Helene and incoming Hurricane Milton, which he warned could be Florida's worst storm in a century. At the same time, political storm clouds are also gathering over presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
It's been a terrible response from the White House.
Playing political games with this moment in these crisis situations. These are the height of emergency situations. It's just utterly irresponsible.
Natural disasters can be pivotal when they strike in the weeks before an election.
If even a small percentage of those undecided independents break one direction or another based on response, it's meaningful.
And with less than a month before voters go to the polls, all eyes will be on the response of those in office and the political temperament of those vying to get into power.
Now, joining us live from Kyiv to discuss the reaction in Ukraine to this development is our Ukraine correspondent, Oz Chatterjee. Good evening, Oz. So, what does this summit's cancellation actually mean for Zelensky's plans?
Well, obviously, this was going to be a very important summit for aid for Ukraine, trying to get another tranche out, not just from the European allies, but from the Americans before the change of administration. But this was also very important for Zelensky's personal peace plan. He's presented parts of it already, but he was going to present the full plan to Biden, to his allies in this summit. Now, Zelensky is visiting Croatia. He's in Dubrovnik today for the Ukraine Southeastern Summit, and he spoke again about the peace plan there. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We've been working on the points of the peace formula, and by November, a document, peace framework, will be ready that outlines the detailed conditions for the just end to the war.
Now, it remains to be seen if there's going to be a further summit between Biden and Zelensky before the US elections. And that throws into question more things, given that we don't know what the outcome of those elections in November will be. And the person he could be discussing, who's sitting in the White House beyond November, could be in no position to influence policy down the line for Ukraine. So this has thrown Zelensky's plans into a bit of turmoil at the moment, with no clarity in sight yet. If there's going to be a meeting, it's going to be very difficult to try and fit one in with this hurricane before the elections in November, which are about 3 weeks away now.
Thank you, Oz. That was Oz Kataji coming to us from Kyiv. Poland is in talks with Ukraine on further military aid deliveries. MiG-29 fighter jets are the most desired type of equipment by Kyiv, according to sources in the Polish Foreign Ministry. But the fighters won't be delivered until Poland can find their replacement.
With this weekend's Ramstein summit postponed, the question remains whether European countries will answer Washington's recent call for additional military support for Ukraine. With that question, the Polish Ministry of Defense has confirmed it's working on the latest package for Kyiv.
So far, we have provided 44 donations to the Ukrainian armed forces, and the 45th support package is in the final stage of preparation. Our assistance has included military equipment, ammunition, individual equipment, fire protection measures, and medical supplies.
According to the ministry's press office, detailed data on the support provided by Poland is not made public for security reasons. What we do know, however, is that Poland still has BWP armored vehicles, PT-91 tanks and MiG-29 fighter jets among some of its older arsenal. According to a Polish foreign ministry source, it's the MiG-29s which are sought after the most by Kyiv. According to Ray Wójcik, a retired US Army colonel, Kyiv wants the Soviet-era equipment because it's the easiest to deploy.
Their older fleet, their MiG-29, where they have most of their experience, they still have a lot of capabilities in maintenance, adaptability, weapon systems use, and understanding of the MiG-29. So therefore, if they got some operational Polish MiG-29s, that would bolster their capabilities.
But before Warsaw can donate the MiGs, it still has to replace them with other, newer models. This condition is non-negotiable, according to the Polish Defense Ministry. Poland is expecting the state-of-the-art F-35 fighter jets from the United States by early 2026 at the earliest. This puts into question if and when could Warsaw donate additional Soviet-era planes to Kyiv, on top of the ones it has already delivered.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and his Czech counterpart Petr Fiala, along with several other high-ranking officials from both countries, got together on Wednesday for the 9th Czech-Polish intergovernmental consultations held in Prague.
With further assistance for Ukraine high on the agenda, the two cabinets have also discussed nuclear cooperation, transport infrastructure and flood protection, which is particularly important following the recent acute flooding caused by Storm Boris that swept through both countries, killing 9 people in Poland and another 5 in the Czech Republic. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk hailed the cooperation between the countries amid the natural disaster.
We collaborated very seriously and with great mutual trust. As a result, the dramatic consequences of the floods on both sides of the border were less severe than they could have been without this cooperation.
But the most burning issue the two prime ministers talked about was both countries' stances on migration. As the EU is planning to crack down on illegal migration by implementing EU-wide asylum system, Spain on Wednesday appealed for the pact to be introduced as of 2025, a year ahead of schedule, whilst Hungary and the Netherlands have sought an opt-out from the bloc's rules on asylum. Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala said that both Poland and the Czech Republic have taken in plenty of refugees from Ukraine, so they shouldn't be lambasted for lack of solidarity.
It is not possible for someone to say to us, now in the context of illegal migration, you will accept illegal migrants, or you contribute to solving this problem. After all, we ourselves have solved one huge problem that Europe had.
Donald Tusk announced that in 3 days he will present a migration strategy that will be a proposal for the EU as a whole. He hopes to stave off migratory pressure resulting from wars and overpopulation in Europe.
I see that few people in Europe still understand this. Today I talked about it for a long time with Prime Minister Fiala about this completely new migration which is organized by Lukashenko and Putin.
According to data by the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, also known as Frontex, Last year, the EU saw some 380,000 irregular border crossings, which marks the highest number since 2016.
Hungary's Viktor Orban clashed with members of the European Parliament on Wednesday. It was supposed to be a moment for Orban to present his current progress on the rotating presidency of the EU, but it turned into a grilling of the Prime Minister's international as well as domestic record.
Hungary's Prime Minister once again showed his defiance in the face of the European Union, lauding his own vision of Europe. At the plenary session of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, Viktor Orban spoke of his so-called achievements, which has mostly been inflammatory rhetoric rather than any meaningful policy.
The Hungarian presidency is interested in improving the European Union, and we believe the success of our presidency will also mean success for the entire European Union. Let us make Europe great again.
The arrival of the Prime Minister was met with harsh tones and criticism from all the main centrist parties. Orban's lack of solidarity with Ukraine was put into particular focus.
Your trip was never a peace mission. It was a big propaganda show for the autocrats and those who are defining our European way of life. Your trip was never a peace mission, it was a war prolongation mission.
Some members of the chamber made their dislike of Orban crystal clear.
Let me tell you on behalf of my group, you are not welcome here. This is the house of European democracy, not of corruption, of lies, of propaganda and autocratic rule. Mr. Orban, you have turned the Hungarian democracy into a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy.
The appearance of Orban also was the first public clash between his primary opponent at home, Peter Magyar, whose message was directed at the Hungarian people and laid bare Orban's weaknesses.
The overwhelming majority of Hungarians voted in favour of joining NATO and the EU, and if there were a referendum today, they would do the same. We are members of the European and Western club. Even if you want to fantasize about economic neutrality, even if you'd rather talk about changing the global system than the real problems of the Hungarian people.
Hungary has not been setting a smooth course, but has acted as a sea anchor against European values and policy, from the recent case of Hungary's sovereignty law going to the European Court of Justice, to holding back support for Kiev. There's a litany of infractions that have pulled down Hungary's profile rather than propel it. At the European Parliament today, it was clear that the rest of Europe has had enough.
As Hurricane Milton heads for Florida, the final evacuation orders have been issued for an area that is home to nearly 4 million people. Towns have been abandoned and highways filled with cars of those fleeing the devastating elements.
Hurricane Milton is heading our way. It will arrive either late tonight or early tomorrow morning. We are bracing and are prepared to receive a major hit.
Hurricane Milton, currently a Category 4 hurricane, neighbouring Category 5, and one of the most intense Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded, is expected to bring sustained winds as high as 250 kilometers per hour. It will be accompanied by life-threatening storm surges and heavy rainfall, and Wednesday was the last call for Florida residents to evacuate.
If you get 10 feet of storm surge, you can't just hunker down with that. That is ultimately the surge. Mother Nature is going to win that fight.
The previous days were marked by people preparing their belongings for the impact, but on Wednesday, the towns on a collision course with Milton were virtually abandoned. With more than 1 million people in Florida under evacuation orders, traffic has shifted to roads leading away from the coast.
We boarded up the windows with metal sheeting. We've cleaned everything up, tried to have some tree limbs and stuff trimmed previous, but really just a matter of getting family together in one spot.
Hurricane Milton will hit an area still struggling to recover from the devastation of Hurricane Helene 2 weeks ago. In addition to battering winds, Milton is forecast to cause flash flooding in the downtown areas of Florida's major cities.
American biochemist David Baker and 2 British computer scientists, Demis Hassabis and John Jumper, have been awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their contribution to the development of protein modeling. Their work is expected to allow for the creation of proteins with pre-designed or bespoke properties.
The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has today decided to award the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry with one half to David Baker, University of Washington, USA, for computational protein design, and the other half jointly to Demis Hassabis and John Jumper.
It would seem that we are seeing a revolution happen before our very eyes. After Tuesday's award in physics for research into machine learning, another Nobel Prize has been awarded for AI-based research. This time, the award in chemistry was given for cracking the complex structure of essentially any known protein in nature.
Well, I could draw a structure that nobody had ever seen before, a completely new protein, and then try to find a sequence that would give this protein. Then I could go to the lab, I could make this sequence, and thus I could make completely new proteins that have never been seen before in nature.
The award-winning research will help make further strides in fields that are vital to humankind.
In medicine, so new drugs, new therapeutical approaches, biosensors, and perhaps also enzymes that can be used in materials and for industry.
One shouldn't underestimate the AI tools that have facilitated these discoveries.
Computer science definitely for both parts of the prize, and the artificial intelligence for the prediction problem. It's so much data that we have not had tools to really analyze and see patterns in data to that extent before.
But does the emergence of AI-led research mean that chemistry and other disciplines will soon see computer scientists snatching all accolades?
Scientists, of course, will be continuously supported by the use of machine learning and other computational approaches, but the AI will not discover new things without the scientists, the experts who know in which direction to search.
After already handing out the Nobel Prizes in medicine, physics and chemistry, later this week the Nobel Committee is set to award the Nobel Prize in Literature and the Nobel Peace Prize, along with the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. The first two of these are far less likely to see AI-driven research be awarded, but we'll find out soon enough.
And now we're going to talk more about the cancelled summit at Ramstein Air Base. The meeting was meant to emphasize the West's unwavering support for Ukraine, but it had to be postponed. To discuss the impact of this decision may have, we have invited Ian Brzezinski, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So the Ramstein Summit of European leaders and U.S. President Joe Biden was supposed to take place on the 12th, and it was supposed to focus on the support for Ukraine. However, due to the hurricane which is about to hit United States, President Biden made a decision to stay. How serious of a setback for President Zelensky do you think this decision is?
This is going to be an important meeting. It's going to be the highest level meeting of the Ramstein Group, summit level, chaired by President Biden. It is going to take place at a time when Ukraine is losing ground in Donbass and Luhansk. So there's urgency to that. And then, of course, winter is approaching, which is a real concern now that Russia has destroyed about a third of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And, of course, Kiev had intended to roll out its victory plan at this meeting. The key purpose, of course, was for the West, the Ramstein Group, to underscore continued commitment to Ukraine at a time of competing priorities and elections, including the violence in the Middle East, increased provocations by China in the Indo-Pacific, and, of course, the U.S. presidential elections. So that was the significance. But the postponement is legitimate. We have a massive hurricane, Hurricane Milton, coming to the United States, hitting one of our major population centers, Tampa. So President Biden needs to stay home. I'm pretty sure this is going to be rescheduled, but it's not quite clear that it'll be at the summit level. We have to keep our fingers crossed for that, because it should be at a summit level.
So, as you mentioned, Zelensky has the victory plan. We know that during his last visit to Washington last month, he did somewhat present the plan to the American side. However, we do not know exactly what the plan is. In your opinion, do you know what the plan could potentially entail, and is it going to change if the summit is going to take place at a later date?
You know, I don't know what the plan is. I can only assume that it probably includes the following elements. increased flows of equipment, less restrictions on the use of those equipment, the lifting of the ban against striking in Russia, NATO membership for Ukraine as part of the win strategy in this war, and probably increased economic sanctions against Russia. I would imagine that would be key elements of the win strategy.
So one of the major issues that was discussed between Ukraine and its Western allies recently was the use of long-range weapons. And we spoke to Biden's advisor, Michael Carpenter, during the Warsaw Security Forum. And he told us recently that those weapons would actually make little difference when it comes to the battlefield, and that the allies should actually focus on providing Ukraine with elements and support when it comes to creating drones and beefing up its defense lines. He said that Biden is going to ask specifically for commitments from Europe when it comes to that support. Do you think this is still going to happen once the summit or the meeting is going to take place?
Well, Ukraine's been requesting the authority, the permission to use long-range strike capabilities against legitimate military targets inside Russia for a long time. And the Biden administration has been balking on this. It fears that such strikes could provoke Russia to escalate the war, possibly even into nuclear war. I believe that those fears are exaggerated. And the fact is that pressure is growing on the administration from other allies who have expressed support for the lifting of these restrictions. This lifting is long overdue because it in effect allowed Russia undeserved and unwarranted safe zone from which to execute its strikes. Ukraine needs the capability to strike Russian command and control centers, logistic hubs, defense industry sites, and other infrastructure that allows Russia to sustain its invasion of Ukraine. It puts Ukraine at a real disadvantage to limit its ability to fight the Russians only on the front lines. That gives a lot of advantage to a country like Russia that has much more, quote unquote, mass than Ukraine has.
So whenever we're looking at this discussion of U.S. approval when it comes to long-range missiles, it becomes sort of a hot topic, so to speak, in the U.S., especially now during the presidential campaign, with some of Trump's closest allies saying that a bad decision could potentially lead to World War III. To what extent do you think that the lack of the bipartisan agreement on how to help Ukraine would actually cause Biden's conservatism in that matter? Or is it something that's been mentioned by some of the commentators before, that he's simply afraid of pulling the U.S. into a larger conflict with Russia?
Well, with all due respect, I mean, I look at the debate in the United States over this issue very differently. It's not a partisan issue. In fact, most Republicans, most Democrats, in fact, I say a vast majority of Republicans, a vast majority of Democrats support releasing these authorities to Ukraine, to allow Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to strike deep into Russia against legitimate military targets. Those who are against it include Joe Biden, the U.S. president, and perhaps President Trump, although I really haven't heard him speak specifically on that issue, but one can infer that from his position on the war. So actually, the Biden administration and possibly President Trump himself are in a distinct minority on this issue.
As we're looking at the summit again, it's supposed to be rescheduled, but we know that in about 4 weeks' time, the U.S. presidential election is going to take place. Is there realistically a change that the summit is going to happen before a possible change in the presidential office in the U.S.?
I'm pretty sure a summit or a high-level strategy type session of the Ramstein Group will occur before the transition of administrations in January. I'm actually betting that this meeting will probably be rescheduled to not too far in the distant future, which will be the next, or the upcoming NATO Defense Ministerial meeting, which I believe is 17-18 October. Because you already have all the defense ministers from the alliance, which is the bulk of the Ramstein Group, convening. So you just add the heads of state on top of that. That, to me, would be the next logical opportunity to have such a gathering.
With that meeting being cancelled and it being supposed to focus on support for Ukraine, do you think that the attention might be somewhat diverted when it comes to the war in the Middle East and the hurricane? Is there going to be less attention put to war in Ukraine and especially less finances, considering that there could be a potential natural disaster taking place in the U.S. and there's obviously another conflict that is continuing in the Middle East?
No, those are separate and distinct. Well, the hurricane is a separate and distinct issue from that. The United States will have the resources to manage the consequences of that hurricane and continue its efforts globally, be it in Europe, in the Middle East, and in Indo-Pacific. The key issue is whether or not the West will actually change its strategy from one focused on escalation control to one focused on enabling Ukraine to win on its terms quickly and decisively. That is the issue at hand.
We know that President Biden made that decision to stay in the U.S., and it's obvious that he has to take that decision. Wouldn't you think it would be a good idea for him to actually send Kamala Harris in order for her to expand her foreign policy portfolio?
Well, that's an obvious thought, but President Biden is personally committed to his policy in Ukraine. You know, while some of us may disagree with his strategy, he is definitely one who has tied his foreign policy legacy to the outcome of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think he wants to personally be present at this gathering, which is a very important one in light of the circumstances in Ukraine today.
When we're looking at both presidential campaigns, we hear contrasting statements by Harris and Trump on how they want to end this war. Mr. Trump promises a quick deal with Putin. Kamala Harris said on Tuesday, actually, that she will not negotiate with Putin without Ukrainian officials being in attendance. There is a lot of fear of what could possibly happen if Donald Trump took office. Are we facing a major shift in the U.S. policy if Trump succeeds in the presidential run?
I think so. You know, Trump is putting himself at risk of being basically the Chamberlain of our time, to play the word on peace on our time. Because if he does what he says he'll do, he'll be basically forcing Ukraine to cede territory to Russia, giving Russia a victory. And that is a recipe for not only continued conflict in Europe, because Putin will move on. He will continue his aggression, but it will also lead others around the world to believe that they can use force and nuclear coercion for their hegemonic ambitions, for their imperial ambitions. And that is dangerous. That was the precedent that was set by Chamberlain. And if Trump is elected and he pursues that course, he'll share that legacy with Chamberlain. With Kamala Harris, I think what we can expect is a continuation of President Biden's support to Ukraine. Maybe a tad more willingness to provide more assistance, but she has not signaled a fundamentally different tact or strategy when it comes to enabling Ukraine to prevail on its terms quickly and decisively.
Last but not least, I would like to take a look at what Financial Times reported recently, saying that some Western capitals are actually pondering on an option of allowing Ukraine to have a partial membership in NATO. And that would mean that the alliance would offer ironclad guarantees to those parts of Ukraine that are in Kyiv's hands. However, it would leave out the contested areas. What would be the U.S.'s position on that?
I wish I knew. You know, there is talk that there is more openness to this concept than before. But I think if it's rolled out in the near term, one needs to make sure that the homework has been done. For example, is this something that will have unanimity within the alliance? Is this something that the administration here in Washington will have walked the U.S. Senate through, as the Senate has an important role in the ratification of protocols of accession? Will such an invitation be an indefinite one with no endpoint, or will it be matched with a process or coupled with a process and a very near-term end date? And then finally, if we extend such membership to Ukraine, how will we ensure the credibility of Article 5? I have to believe I think one has to believe that in order for that Article 5 commitment to be credible, you're going to have to see the deployment of allied forces onto Ukrainian territory. That's what I would be watching for as this possibility evolves.
Definitely.
And with that said, I would say I think it's very important that we get Ukraine into NATO as quickly as possible as part of the win strategy in this conflict.
Thank you. That leaves us with a lot to think about, most certainly. Ian Brzezinski, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO, former policy. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
And so this would be all here on World News Tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please stay here on TVP World for more news and features.